I'm very happy to be here. My name is Natalie Jellinek. I work as an educational developer at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, SLU. And it's really exciting to be here and sharing a little bit about what we do. And I was really happy to hear kind of the end of this panel discussion, because I think you really gave me a nice transition, because you ended, if we think of this triangle for sustainable development, you ended with kind of looking at the social aspect. And I want to highlight this idea of looking at education and how we can really think about what we do when we teach, how we teach, and why we teach what we teach, and how really internationalization can come into these aspects, moving kind of above and beyond mobility. So I'm really happy to hear that this was kind of the end, open question mark at the end, and I want to highlight this, what Gunnar was saying. So I'm going to move from this into my presentation and talk a little bit about how we've at SLU, or are trying to, because I think it's a process, to move from policy and thinking about documents to really implementing actions. So am I supposed to press now? And then it comes, or? Okay, this is scary. All right, so this is SLU here. Okay, and this is what I'm going to be talking about, moving from policy to practice and thinking about what are some of the kind of nitty-gritty implementing actions that we can do. I work as an educational developer, which means that I work with training researchers, doctoral students, teaching staff, and I also am involved with doing capacity development in internationally with some SIDA finance projects. So, this is what I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk very briefly about SLU because I want to move to what I think is key here, looking to how we teach. But I think it was important to discuss a little bit about SLU in case not everyone is familiar with our university, and then a little bit, very, very briefly, about what internationalization looks like at SLU. And then this policy document that we've worked on, and how from this policy document we've thought about what are some implementing actions in the area that I am going to focus on, which is teaching and learning, and looking at how kind of internationalization at home can be a part of this process. And then concluding, thinking about the link to the title of this conference. What does sustainable internationalization really mean, or what could it mean, right? So this is the mission statement for SLU, and we have a mission statement. I will let you read it. 3 key pillars, right? Education, research, and then what is kind of unique about SLU is this part about environmental analysis. And for SLU, the idea of Agenda 2030 and kind of our subject areas are very closely linked in very natural ways to the SDGs. So that's kind of part of the way that SLU sees itself. And here you see some of the subjects that SLU takes on, and you see again the idea of sustainability kind of really being integrated in the way that SLU is trying to define its programs and its actions. And this is SLU in figures. And what's not here is that SLU is, we call ourselves the longest university in Sweden, so we have campuses all over Sweden, which also has in many ways pushed us to think about virtual mobility from very early on, and how to have students and staff and researchers participate in things without always having to actually move. So we have campuses, our central campus in Uppsala, and then we have in the north in Umeå, and in the south in Alnarp. So 40-degree programs, 200 professors, 3,700 full-time students, and the ambition to double the number of students in the what would be the bachelor's and master's programs by 2027. So looking at the numbers at 2017, it's a huge project that SLU is taking on, which is also linked a little bit to what was being mentioned in the panel about thinking about broader recruitment, and how to kind of reach non-traditional groups at SLU. And then we have SLU's work with Agenda 2030, which is really important to highlight. SLU has its own policy for how the university is attempting to really contribute to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. And SLU has chosen particular goals that we think are very much in line with what I mentioned, the subject areas that SLU covers, but really thinking that all of these goals, as you know, really feed into one another, and trying to think about them as a set, right? And thinking of these perspectives as kind of an overarching idea. So internationalization at SLU, very briefly, as many of the universities in Sweden, we're very keen on international collaboration. We have several partnerships, both with universities kind of in the same area, such as the European League, the EuroLeague for Life Sciences. We have the Global Challenges University Alliance, which is an alliance of 11 universities around the world, really looking to solve kind of what we call global challenges, which is what the Agenda 2030 really is trying to do also, is thinking about these problems that really are not, that cannot be solved by an individual or by one country, but really need kind of perspectives and resources and a kind of collaborative approach to tackle them. We have an office or a unit actually called SLU Global, which is where SLU looks to its contribution to Agenda 2030 in low-income countries. So how to really push for collaborations, capacity development in low-income countries, and what SLU can do to contribute in those areas. And I really wanted to highlight the idea of moving beyond mobility when we think of what internationalization is. And since I work with teacher training, this is kind of my, what I would have tattooed on my arm, kind of internationalization of the curriculum, really pushing us to think, well, if what was mentioned earlier is true, right? Not everyone can move. Not everyone wants to move. Not everyone has the possibility to move. Nor should we expect everyone to move, given what we know about moving and what impact that might have on the climate, etc. How do we really bring all these international comparative perspectives into what we do today, and how do we do that? And this is what internationalizing the curriculum is about, and this is what internationalizing at home is about, thinking about what we do when we don't move, which I think is really important. And then we move also, right? So we also have the mobility aspects, because we kind of can't escape that, as was already mentioned. And we have students that come from all over the world at SLU, and that's just so that you can see a little bit about where people come from. Okay, so internationalization and kind of the Agenda 2030 and how we want to move from policy to practice. So we have the document that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which is the National Strategy for Internationalization, the Swedish National Strategy, which really put pressure, and I think good pressure, right, to universities in Sweden to think about what is internationalization like, and linking this to quality. How are we really making sure that internationalization is meaningful, and what does that mean? So based on that, SLU started working on, in addition to having internationalization as an idea in its mission and its vision, really thinking about a document where we could outline some concrete steps, practices, activities that the university could do as a whole. And we really wanted to be kind of looking at the university, kind of in a holistic way, and trying to think of where internationalization could come in and how. And then we come to my kind of bottom part of the triangle here, which is the implementing actions. So comprehensive internationalization, right, is what the national Swedish strategy really strives for, and it was an inspiration for us when we tried to develop this SLU document. And I have here in red this idea of international and comparative perspectives, because I want to come back to that, because this is, you know, what we think we should be looking at when we teach and when we train our teaching staff to deal with, right, like internationalization in practice. So we had this process, and I have my colleague Helena Eklund-Snell here, who was really a key kind of driving force behind this document. We had a working group from different parts of the university that tried to kind of outline some key actions to move right from this overarching document to implementation. And it was a process, quite an interesting one, of trying to see, well, how do we get buy-in? How much can a university kind of push faculties and departments and administration to do things? What type of buy-in do we need? So it was a lot of negotiation, and in the end we ended up with a document where we have lots of suggestions, but where we really aren't able to force at this point the implementation. So we will see how things develop. And it's quite a broad document. It includes much more than what I am going to talk about today. It's a set of suggestions and actions in the areas of mobility with targets, in internationalization at home, and also kind of in internal coordination in terms of what SLU could do. So some of the examples of the things that I want to focus on more when it comes to teaching and learning are: how do we develop these intercultural competences for both teachers and students? And so I work with teachers, so you know, kind of our rationale would be that in order for us to reach the students, we have to reach the teachers first, and it is through them that then our students will get also all of these competencies that we think are so important. How do we really integrate these perspectives into what is being taught, and not only in terms of content, but also in terms of what, how we are teaching it? What is the methodology that we are using? How are we, you know, what do our classrooms look like, and how are we kind of structuring our programs? And then highlighting what is already kind of internationalized content, right, which is very much linked to Agenda 2030. So then we think, okay, so if we're going to focus on internationalization at home, one of the kind of key implementing actions would be really trying to think about how do we train researchers and teaching staff in these key areas. The international classroom, right? So this is what happens when we have all this mobility, right? Most of the time in English, but it could be in any language, really. And how do we really train intercultural competence? And I'm going to come back to the idea of this international classroom and what we should call it. So if we have, you know, this proposal of idea, then how do we implement it? And when we start thinking about what this can look like, I think automatically we have this link, or we should have this link to Agenda 2030, and particularly to this target 4.7, which outlines, you know, education for sustainable development. And I'm glad sustainable development was brought up, and I think we have to make a difference, or kind of a layer idea behind what education for sustainable development is, which is not only what we teach, but also how we teach it, and what are the competencies that we think would emerge from the way that we teach and the way that we approach the content, which could very much be related to Agenda 2030 and all of these kind of global challenges. So if we think, okay, we need to kind of merge or integrate or marry these two, we can look kind of closer at what 4.7 says. And here you have this idea of global citizenship, appreciation of cultural diversity, which really brings us even closer to what internationalization of the curriculum is. Right? So we can't escape trying to think of these as partners in quality education in the context that we're in today. And when we think of education for sustainable development, at SLU we have had kind of a process where we've thought about how to integrate this into the curriculum. So we have a history of working with education for sustainable development, but we really haven't done it kind of linked to our internationalization endeavors, right? So we've done kind of parallel tracks in a way up until now, where we're trying to think of how to really integrate these two. And I just wanted to show you what we've done in terms of education for sustainable development. So in 2014, there was a decision taken by the Vice Chancellor that we should really try to do a kind of a drive in education for sustainable development, both for those who are teaching, but also for the people that are study directors, right? So those of you that work within with teaching or administrators, you know that in order for you to have an impact, you also need to think about how things fit together, right? Because otherwise it doesn't make sense as a program afterwards. So this idea of really training all study directors by 2016. So it was a 2-year drive, and this is where we are today. As of October 2019, all study directors have been trained at SLU. And 320 course leaders have been trained in education for sustainable development. This is a 2-day workshop. And this is very much linked to kind of SLU's vision. And so you have here this idea of solving real problems, theory and practice. And this is from SLU. It's one of its, what we call our core values. Yeah? So if we move on trying to kind of build kind of layer upon layer, we have this idea of internationalization at home and how important it is. We have education for sustainable development. So what are some of the proposed actions that can emerge from this new document that I have just mentioned? So we have to think of these two together. And what are some of the what could be included in this training. And you see here I put global classroom, and maybe some of you are thinking, oh, you know, she missed a letter there. But it's really, I call it the global classroom because I think many times we end up thinking, well, how do we design teaching and learning activities or trainings or whatever for the international students, right? How do we talk about the international classroom, and so we create this kind of us versus them. And so I think we need to move away from that and really think of this, and I don't even think we can call it new classroom. It's, you know, if we think of how to teach mixed groups, people that have different ideas about how the world functions, different ways of seeing things, different perspective, different academic traditions, we are going to improve the quality of teaching, whether we have a group of people that come from 10 different countries or 10 different municipalities in Sweden. So that's why this is, it says the global classroom, kind of the marriage of this international global with the local. Right? And again, coming back to the idea that we don't really need to move to include internationalization in our teaching. So, and these, there's no priority in these. I'm going to put them all up here. So, kind of a linking to Agenda 2030, right, in terms of content, and again, in terms of what it means if we think of this target 4.7. Education for sustainable development, not only what, right? So we have our nice little triangle with our 3 dimensions, but also how. How do you teach with an education for sustainable development perspective? How do you create ethical decision makers, or how do you develop intercultural competencies? How do you really learn to work with people that are different from you? What does that mean for you as a teacher? How do you then teach? The idea of global citizenship, which comes up both in internationalization and in Target 4.7. How do we really include international and comparative perspectives in our learning outcomes? A lot of times, if we don't include them in our learning outcomes, they tend to disappear from our curriculum because what we assess is our learning outcomes, as many of you know. Interdisciplinarity, right, working across disciplines, and also thinking about intersectionality and thinking about how, you know, questions of identity and how that might come into play in the way we communicate and in the way we interact with each other. What does it mean to come from another place to Sweden? You know, all of these different kind of power struggles and things that might be a bit difficult to discuss sometimes, but are really important. And the integration of this international and comparative perspective, and really thinking about then intercultural competence and how we develop that in our teachers so that they can lead our students to have an increased intercultural competence. And this, I think, and I'm kind of an optimist in terms of what I think we can do. But what was mentioned during the panel about international students feeling isolated and us not being able to integrate them, this is not something that happens, I think, at one university. I think we all struggle with that. And my argument would be that things like these, really kind of empowering our teachers, our staff, our researchers, our doctoral students who also teach, to use the classroom as a resource, I think would have a great impact on improving the experience, not only of these international students who might feel isolated, but of the overall student population. So what would be then kind of a conceptual conclusion? I think we could say that, okay, we have to think about how these two fit together, and maybe we have to think that when we do one, we should be doing the other. And that really integrating Agenda 2030 into the way that you teach, just by doing that, you are also internationalizing your curriculum, and that we should really think about not only what we teach, but really how we teach it. And maybe that is what at least one part of sustainable internationalization could be. And then I think we have to consider also how we follow up, right? So I can stand up and talk about lots of initiatives, about things that we could do and how we could train our teaching staff, but also thinking about, well, what does that mean? What happens to the way that we teach? How do students see the world? Who should be doing the follow-up? Should there be some kind of national follow-up to see where we are 10 years from now? Because in the end, what we want, if we reach ever, right? If we ever reach the Sustainable Development Goals, what we want is to improve the quality of life for people. And so we need to be able to measure our impact also to make sure that we're on the right track. Yeah? And that's what I had to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We actually had a comment saying, why don't we do these things in English? So I'm very happy that you just switched to English, just to accommodate that question. Before we take a break, I just need to ask one brief question. You must have encountered a lot of obstacles with teachers during this process. What are some of them? And how did you overcome them? Just some brief way.
Yes, I think that change, or I think a lot of times staff, teachers are stressed for time. I think time is a scarce resource, and I think that when you tell people that you need to do additional things and additional trainings and think, oh no, now I have to internationalize and now I have to put this in my teaching, it feels like a heavy burden. So I think one strategy is trying to see what people are already doing and highlight, some of the maybe simple ways in which this can be done, so that people don't feel that all of a sudden they have to change their whole curriculum or their whole course in order to be working in this way. I also think, sometimes we think, like students are ahead of the curve, and there was a report, I want to say at least 5 years ago, from the National Swedish Student Union. I think it's called Teaching in English or something like that, which highlights like the key to really, moving away from language and really thinking about training faculty as a key element in this kind of teaching in English process. So I think students, would agree.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.